Thank you very much, Professor Saffeling, and good afternoon to all guests joining us both online and in person here at the storied courtroom. We will now have a special opening discussion that will be moderated by Professor Patricia Wiater. Professor Wiater holds the Chair for Public Law, Public International Law and Human Rights at the Friedrich-Alexander-Universität of Erlangen-Nürnberg, and she will be joined at the judges' bench by three distinguished panelists. She is also the director of the Human Rights Clinic there, and she will now introduce both the focus of the discussion as well as her fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now it's better. I am delighted that my friend and colleague Christoph Saffeling has invited me to moderate this opening discussion. And I have the honor of welcoming three fascinating guests here in Nuremberg in the famous courtroom 600. As we've learned in the following days, the Nuremberg Forum will address international and domestic legal framework designed to protect children's rights during armed conflict. And in our opening discussion, we have the opportunity for a broader introduction to the topic, including the legal perspective, but also going beyond it. So its purpose is to achieve a better understanding of the harm that armed conflict inflict on children, and our speakers will help us to develop this broader understanding. In addition to the extremely important legal protection of children, there's an equally significant need for societal responsibility and the responsibility of the international community to help the children of war to process their experiences and to establish prevention mechanisms. And our guests, as I said, will provide us with very different perspectives. And I hope that after our 70 minutes discussion, we will somehow have a somewhat better understanding of the complexity of the topic. These different perspectives include the legal perspective of Professor Anne Skelton, who advocates for children's rights through the various fields of law. They include the psychological perspective of Dr. Yael Danieli, who focuses, among other things, on the optimal care for severely traumatized victims. And they include the perspective of Jasminko Halilovic, who provides a forum for the children of war through a museum-based culture of remembrance. All of our guests have very impressive and very extensive CVs, and I hope you forgive me for picking out just some aspects of your important work. No forgiveness? Of course. Good. Dr. Yael Danieli is Emerita Distinguished Professor of International Psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. She's working as a clinical psychologist, as a pioneer traumatologist, psychohistorian, and victimologist. And I hope, dear Yael Danieli, that you make this very complex job description a little more comprehensible for a lawyer like me. Yael not only incorporates as a person the variety of perspectives as an academic and as a practitioner, she also creates institutional spaces and alliances to open up a dialogue about the intergenerational consequences of trauma caused by war and terror. And this networking activity covers an impressive period of time, an impressive range of topics. Truly a pioneer of her time, in the 60s and 70s, Yael Danieli started a group project for Holocaust survivors and their children that, among other things, organized intergenerational community meetings and led therapy groups for the children of survivors. And Yael still is a pioneer. Some years ago, she founded the International Center for MultiGenerational Legacies of Trauma, of which she acts as director. And again, the center creates spaces for exchange and dialogue among social scientists and lawyers and the public in order to raise awareness of the suffering incurred through multi-generational legacies of trauma, and in order to find ways to prevent the destructive legacies from being passed on to future generations. So welcome, dear Yael Danieli. Creating a space for sharing experiences and facilitating dialogue is also the concern of our guest, Jasminko Halilovic. His involvement with children's rights began with the far-reaching idea of giving the children of war a voice and letting them have their say. In 2010, out of personal experience, Jasminko Halilovic started working on the book War Childhood, Sarajevo 1992 to 1995. And he launched a call for people to send their short answer to the simple but important question, what was the war childhood for you? And this initiative has not only resulted in a very successful book publication, congratulations on this. The response from the children affected, today's adults, was so overwhelming that Jasminko Halilovic, with a group of volunteers, founded the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo, whose general director he is. And the museum's collection contains items and documents that tell stories about the memories of war childhood. As said on the museum's webpage, it documents children's stories of war childhood and their experience and the experience of those who played no role in the start of the war and still suffered multiple consequences. The museum and your, Jasminko Halilovic's, vision is to overcome post-traumatic experiences and to prevent traumatization of others, at the same time advancing mutual understanding. Welcome to Nuremberg, dear Jasminko. In your work as the chairperson of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, a UN treaty body, dear Anne Skelton, you also create room for dialogue, a space for dialogue, but a very special one. In the framework of the monitoring task of the committee, you create a dialogue between the committee, a group of experts on the rights of children on the one hand, and state representatives on the other, states who may be accused of violating or neglecting children's rights. As part of its monitoring task, the committee is also confronted with a special situation of children's rights in conflict situation and the implementation of the optional protocol to the Convention on the Involvement of Children in Armed Conflict. I find this very interesting, dear Anne Skelton, that you cover the whole branch of or range of possibilities to enforce children's rights because you have experience with the international and the domestic legal framework. In addition to your experience with the committee's work and enforcement tools, you have mobilized domestic enforcement mechanisms since you've pioneered strategic litigation on children's rights in South Africa and appeared as a counsel before the South African Constitutional Court. And also, Anne Skelton's work is of multi-perspectiveness. She's not only a children's rights practitioner, but also a professor of law at the University of Pretoria and the University of Leiden, where she holds the chair entitled Children's Rights in a Sustainable World. Welcome, dear Anne Skelton. I would like to discuss to start our discussion and the conversation with a statement which was made by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2023 on the occasion of the World's Children's Day. And you will know the text I'm now quoting. The committee said, I quote, "World Children's Day has generally been regarded as a day to celebrate the gains made since the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Right of the Child in 1989. 34 years later today, it, however, has become a day for mourning for the many children who have recently died in armed conflict. With one out of every 5 children worldwide living within armed conflict zones, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child marks World Children's Day in a somber mood. 1 out of every 5 children. This is a shocking number. And if you agree, I would like to zoom in and take maybe a differentiated look at the different armed conflicts we are confronted with right now at the moment in the world, because we see that there are different types of conflict. We see that there are interstate conflicts, conflicts between states like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but we also see that there are many conflicts within borders between governmental representatives of governmental powers and armed groups. So what are there different effects on children and children's suffering depending on the type of conflict we are facing? Amnesty International stated, no matter the cause of war or the forces involved, the results are often the same. Would you agree? I posed this question as an open question. Maybe, Anne, you want to respond first. And maybe, Yael, you want to continue with the psychological perspective.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for those introductions and greetings to all the honored guests and participants here. Because I come from a legal perspective, perhaps my brain goes immediately to obligations. And therefore, one of the differences that we might think about when we're considering the impact of armed conflict and the responsibility for those impacts will differ depending on whether we're talking about the national level or whether we're talking about the international level. And what I think has been very distinctive about the response over the past couple of years is a much higher level of awareness around the world about the impact of war on children. There was a time just a few years ago when talking about children in armed conflict, everybody's minds went to child soldiers. Now, when we think about children in armed conflict, what we think about is children dying, children being maimed, children being separated from their parents, children being orphaned, children not eating. And that comes to our mind long before recruitment, although, of course, recruitment will also be happening in those contexts as well. So my thinking is that as far as international conflict is concerned, the awareness in the world has raised considerably. What we can still debate is whether it's made any difference, because we still are seeing these impacts despite, I would say, an outpouring of horror amongst people in the world. The problem with domestic conflicts is that they remain rather hidden from the rest of the world, although they engulf societies. And as we know, there is a bias looking at it from a Western perspective, a lot of othering when it comes to armed conflict. But what's also been interesting about the recent armed conflicts is that they have galvanized interest and concern and grief all over the world. Whereas I think domestic conflicts are still somewhat hidden at the international level.
Yael Danieli, would you like to comment on the effects from a psychological perspective? Yeah? No, it doesn't work. One speaker only.
I was worried that I won't have a voice in Germany again. So thank you for fixing that. I think there's another perspective to the ones you mentioned. I know that at least of the people I know in this room, Judge Son and I are children of the wars of the 40s, of the 1940s. So we can also speak about what happens to a child when it becomes 83 or 84. We can actually tell you, but we can tell you later. For me, when I review from a point of view of a child what's happening in the world today, humanity is at war with itself. when you talk about children, you're killing the future of humanity. You're distorting the future of humanity. Even when they stay alive, they will carry the wounds one way or the other. They might even contribute deeply and widely to humanity. Some child survivors, as you know, Tom Bjorgenthal, who is no longer with us, contributed a great deal. I would think we have some contribution too. And we know many others who have, such as Elie Wiesel, such as, I can just mention names all over the world. At the same time, it's like living at least two lives. One is that child that cries every so often, whether you know what you're crying about or not. And one is the very successful adult that lives by the rule of making the world a better place, partly driven by that child. But for example, when I came to the hotel 2 days ago, the first thing I realized was that our hotel is actually on the land where the racial laws were made. In 1935, that's today in the news was in the city here of Sites. Some people ripped and stole the names of Holocaust victims. You know, they have them, what do you call it, stubble? Somebody ripped and stole it in this country. And some of my friends from all over the world wrote so much hate. We have to remember that. We have to remember that even when you survive, and partly you try to make the world a better place, you are more vulnerable to everything that happens all around the world. You become like a child, like any other child. Yasmin, I'm so sorry to have missed the fact that you're a child of war too. I was being unfair to the more recent, to the younger children. And thank you for speaking from your age. But I want to speak, to add to some to what Anne mentioned. Don't forget rape in times of war. Don't forget wars that are not called wars, like in countries such as Denmark, wonderful country, as was Germany and hopefully is Germany for the future, right? They would put coils in 11-year-old indigenous girls, 11-year-old, without painkillers, but that's besides the point. They didn't just harm the girl. They killed off the possibility of her children, right, of the next generation. I can go on and on and on. The children hostages today in Ukraine, in Israel, the Yazidi children of hostages, we have working groups all over the world for them, so I talk with them all the time. It's part of what we listen to and learn from. And I often say, actually, that I'm an expert because I listen to victims. It's the only reason, because when I was studying, there was no training to work with victims, right? There was no training at all. We became expert because we very humbly listen, learn, listen, learn. Now, the hostages, it's very interesting. So, for example, just this week, from a Yazidi freed hostage, he freed himself, he escaped. He taught us that the younger ones, the littler children, are the ones who are more open to indoctrinations. Because they don't know yet, right? These adults are talking to them, they're feeding them, they're telling them. And that the older ones, he's old, he's 9 years old, right? They were already more defended against being indoctrinated. We hear the same story from Ukrainian freed hostage children about being indoctrinated and by being told that nobody cares. The hostages from Israel, same story. That your parents don't care, your country doesn't care, they don't give a damn if you live or die. And this is a way to also torment them, not just to take them hostage, but to torment them as much as possible. And if they cry, of course, they get beat up because they're not allowed to cry. I can go on and on and on. And this is just 1 week.
May
okay?
I ask
Please.
Jasminko about that? Jasminko Halilovic, these are very, very important aspects. Yael is mentioning the age of a child suffering from a conflict situation, a war, terrorism, and also the storytelling behind the conflict. How is the story described to a child? What is the narrative behind this conflict situation, the suffering? Can you share your experiences in this regard? I listened to one of your interviews where you said you yourself realized how important age is when it comes to experiencing war.
Yes, the both points that were made also by the report you quoted and by the colleague about different contexts and the different kinds of conflicts, how do they affect children in different ways, but also children of different age are relevant. At the War Childhood Museum, we have the collection of over 6,000 objects and testimonies from 20 different armed conflicts, starting with the Second World War to the ongoing wars today. And the question we often face and think about is, what do they tell us when it comes to similarities or differences when we look at these experiences? And there we come often to a kind of contradicting conclusion, that the experience of war childhood is at the same time universal experience, but also very individual experience. So you can find similarities in different conflicts, but you can also find differences in the same street or in the same house. The war can be completely different for a brother and sister growing up in the same apartment. Also, of course, the cultural differences, the intensity of conflict, it's not the same today if you are a child in Kharkiv or in Kiev, although the whole country is at war, suffering from Russian invasion. The level of destruction is different. So all of this, of course, affects in its own way. When it comes to the age, I think what we see from our collection is what was already mentioned. It's a level of awareness about things. For example, I was 4 years when war started in my country, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And my generation, we were 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. We didn't really realize what's happening outside of our realities. So I remember in 1994, there was a World Cup in football and we had electricity and I was watching a football match with my father and I asked him how it's possible that people go to the stadium when it's war, because I couldn't realize that the world is big, and there is life outside of this context. At the same time, let's say teenagers who were 12 plus or something like that, we can see in their testimonies a lot of awareness. They knew which music their peers were listening to. They were missing how to get these records. It was not time of internet and technology. It was a different time, obviously. But we can see much more awareness, and then this is a completely different way to deal with things. But obviously also what was mentioned in one of the opening remarks, story about war childhood often comes down to basic protection. And it's very difficult to debate the specificities of the experience when we have these children on display who are telling us, my brother was killed, what will you do to protect me? And I think this comes down to two main powers. It's military power and political power. And this is something I think we need also to talk about at these events and to see why we are not doing enough.
Thank you. When it comes to the individuality or singularity of experiencing, are there kind of resilience factors a child can have or cannot have in the moment of the suffering? So out of your experience, professional experiences, is, for example, family support a condition which helps going through a harmful and traumatic situation? Because I've learned from the wonderful and really informative webinars the center is doing, I can recommend watching the webinars, that in working on traumata and helping after the conflict, there are resilience factors. But are there factors which can help children survive a situation in the ongoing conflict situation?
Let me start through it, a simple principle, right? Trauma, any trauma, is a rupture, right, of the continuity, the multidimensional continuity of one's life. And depending on what dimension you examine or attend to, it may or may not have been ruptured, right? So not all trauma leads to all the same conclusions. No simple fix-it-all. Please, when I hear the phrase trauma-informed, it always makes me a little nervous. Not a little, really nervous. Because while it's a great progress in the thinking of the field and really in our interdisciplinary thinking, which should be applauded, the individuals often get forgotten, and the uniqueness of the individual gets forgotten, right? Because, again, like adults, children respond differently. One cries and goes to the corner, right? One fights, right? Or tries to change the situation. One tries to reason with the killers. They succeed sometimes. It's sort of extraordinary what happens during war, where humanity sort of surprises you. So first of all, part of what we want in healing is to recreate continuity, to reestablish continuity. It doesn't mean to go back to the past. That doesn't work. We have a new normal after wars, as we called it after 9/11. But you want to somehow create continuity, right? To heal that rupture as much as you can. So for example, anytime you are there with a child, you would want to think, what can the child do at that moment? Not what the child cannot do. What is not only the helplessness, but what can the child, right? Where is the voice? The voice is there in many cases, if we listen to it. Okay? I remembered when I went to Rwanda the first time, the next day, it was a Sunday, and they put me in a church with a lot of orphans and widows and said, talk to them. Okay, talk to them. So I didn't know much, didn't know quite how to approach them. So I decided I'll tell them about what we've learned about children. And it was the first time I sort of freely spoke about what did we learn from being Jewish in this world, right? And one of the principles I shared, and the children were like totally with me. I said, you know, the world can take everything away from you. Everything you own can take everybody you love, who loves you, away from you. Yes, it's true. The world can take everything, or try to take everything. But no one can take away what you have inside. So let's talk about what you have inside. And there's a lot inside. Not only trauma and grief and horrendous memories, also remembering mother's voice, right? Remembering how father came to say goodnight. And that is healing, do you see, without any smart psychological mechanisms. Just remembering that there was a past, and therefore there is a chance for a future. And whatever you carry here, nobody can take away. So you can watch over it. You can care for yourself too, even if there's no one else that you knew before. So part of what I'm saying is, and indeed, so this is a simple, just a simple notion that is fantastic, actually, if you think about it. One of the difficulties of law and of the field of trauma is that very often they tend to be ahistorical, right? We're having this case. Forget the past, forget the future, forget how long it takes to establish a case and go on. It's very important to not forget the time dimension. The age of the child matters, right? That's a time dimension. At age 2 or 3, you have one person. By the time that person is a victim in your case, that person might be 10 or 12. Thinks differently, feels differently, relates to the world differently, has different relationship with the perpetrator sometimes if they live in the same place too. So the time dimension is totally essential. And I know some of you know, Christoph knows us, just like the Academy. Our center is very committed to examining the notion of time. How long does a trial take, right? How long does justice take? What does it mean in terms of children?
May I add to this?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you must stop me because I can just talk.
So the two of us can speak together. Notice that, German and Australian voice can speak together. Talking about the time dimension and Skelton, and the question of a direct reaction or direct help during an ongoing conflict, the committee has reviewed several states involved in ongoing armed conflicts. What is your understanding on the potential that can result from these types of intervention or reporting in an ongoing situation? Because the dimension of time, you are absolutely right, but the law always has to be applied to a very specific factual situation, and sometimes it happens to be an ongoing armed conflict. So what's your experience with this kind of legal support in ongoing conflicts?
Well, the way that the Committee on the Rights of the Child works is that it reviews all the states parties in the world that have ratified the convention, which is every state except the United States of America is the only one left. And incidentally, the United States of America has ratified the optional protocol on children and armed conflict, although people don't mention this very often. But this happens in a cyclical way. And the committee doesn't have a lot of capacity to go and do outreach work when it sees a need. So other than being able to put out statements, which we do from time to time to draw attention to the suffering of children in acute situations. So we often feel rather helpless compared with, special rapporteurs and special representatives of the Secretary General who have more of their mandate allows them to go. But it so happens that every now and again a state comes before the committee that is in an armed conflict, and we've had that experience twice since I've been the chairperson. Russia came to be reviewed by the committee, and we have just reviewed Israel in the last session, just a month ago. And at one level, it's interesting that states that are in armed conflict still come to be reviewed under the convention. What they hope we will focus on are the children in the country, in that part of the country that is not involved in the armed conflict. So, for example, in our recent interaction with Israel, they were focusing on children in Israel, not children in the occupied Palestinian territories, because they said that they believe that the convention does not operate, as far as they are, they're not responsible for the operation of the convention in the occupied territories. And of course they dispute whether they are occupied territories. So it's a rather long explanation that they went into. We simply said to them, the Committee on the Rights of the Child is worried about all children everywhere. And therefore, as far as we're concerned, we view these to be occupied Palestinian territories as the UN does. And therefore, we are going to be asking you questions about the convention, about all the children. And yes, we are concerned, of course. We also asked about child hostages and the impact of the 7th of October events on children in Israel. But we also asked a lot of questions about children in the occupied territories. And what was interesting about Israel's position is that they did acknowledge that humanitarian law applies there. And it so happens that the Convention on the Rights of the Child in Article 38 includes both international humanitarian law and international human rights law. So therefore we were able to ask a lot of questions. And therefore we were able to talk about the conflict that is happening now and the issues and our concerns and we asked a lot of questions about what they are doing and what they are preventing from happening, such as the denial of humanitarian aid and the impact that was having on children. And interestingly enough, in the opening session, the ambassador recalled the memory of a Polish hero who died during the Second World War, who was a children's rights activist. I then responded by also reminding about the fact that at the end of the First World War, it was the suffering of children in Germany that really led up to the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. This is a not often known story, but I'll explain what happened. The Declaration on the Rights of the Child, which is 100 years old this year, was the key drafter of it was an English woman called Eglantine Jebb and her sister Dorothy. And in fact, she was very aware of the suffering of children because during the war, she and her sister were translating foreign newspapers into English to help English people understand what was happening to children, not only in England and allied countries, but elsewhere as well. And at the end of the war, there was a blockade that was preventing food from reaching children in Europe. And so babies were dying, children were dying in Germany and Austria and other places, Russia also. And she drew attention to this and she issued pamphlets with a picture of a starving German baby. Now you can imagine this is just after the First World War, and English people were not very sympathetic to starving German babies. But she insisted that we cannot look away, even if the children of the enemy are starving. We have to be concerned about this as well. And that led to, she was arrested for her pamphleteering and for writing on the pavements in the UK. And she was prosecuted, and she decided to do her own defense so that she could tell the story all over again in court. And at the end, she was fined £5, and the prosecutor offered to pay her fine. And she took his £5 and she said, I will pay my own fine, but I will take this as the first donation for the organization Save the Children, which was then established in 1919. But that work to raise funds, a charitable idea of trying to help starving children who were children of the enemy, and they spoke about the fact that, we don't have enemies under 7, they said. And in the same way today, when we think about starvation in Sudan, starvation in Gaza, and Myanmar, can we look away? How can we look away?
What was the reaction of the Israeli representative?
Well, they said, of course, it is very regrettable in some kind of slightly removed way. It is regrettable what's happening to children in Gaza. They acknowledge that. But, of course, what is needed is a ceasefire, and that has already been said by the United Nations.
Do you want to directly respond? Just one. It is about raising awareness. That's what you, even if the direct reaction was not the one you might have hoped for.
Yes, and of course,
awareness.
The dialogue leads to concluding observations, and which are then given back. Which also, I'll talk about that more tomorrow when we talk about what the committee can do. But of course, it requires all the states of the world to put the necessary pressure behind this. So it's just one small drop in that ocean of concern that has to come.
And raising awareness is also something the War Childhood Museum is currently doing with regards to the Russian invasion and the suffering of Ukrainian children. Maybe you want to describe your ongoing efforts during, again, an ongoing conflict, and raising awareness the museum is trying to do with this project.
Yeah, let me just go back to the two things which were mentioned. It's the aspect of time and how long it takes for justice to come. And this brings me back why we actually created the War Childhood Museum. I think we partly created it to bring some justice to our generation. Because after the war ends, you understand that justice might never come in a way. And I think survivors and victims are quite modest when it comes to expectations for justice. All of us know, and we knew during the war, after the war, and today in the conflicts we are witnessing, the child which is bombed in Gaza or in Ukraine, elsewhere, they know that most likely the perpetrator will never be brought to justice. It's just unlikely. Some of them might, but majority won't. And even like in this city where we are talking today, only a small percentage of perpetrators are brought to justice. And it's always like that. So then I think what survivors and victims do is they redefine justice to themselves. And they say, okay, this is the case, but then I will find justice in something else. And very often what we see as a museum, people find justice in telling their story, in sharing their story. And this is, I think, in the essence of existence of the War Childhood Museum, being this platform where people can share their story in a safe way, in a safe place, and have this kind of healing journey with the museum in order to achieve some personal justice. And we see this even with people from the Second World War, affected by the Second World War. We see this in a woman who is more than 80 years old, who entered our museum, and she lost father in the Second World War, and she said that only now, after 70 years, she feels she found home after entering the museum. But we also see it in the families affected today, when we took an artwork from a child in Ukraine and exhibited in the Council of Europe in our pop-up exhibition there, we got the feedback from this family that he was very happy that his work and his story advocates for his generation and his peers at such important place. So I think this power of storytelling and importance of these platforms, not only to raise awareness, but also for those who use these platforms. And not only for those who use these platforms, but also for the wider community who can feel represented. So this is the kind of platform that does not present to people; it represents the people. I think it's very important also in the context of justice, because courts and jailing perpetrators is extremely important, but it just won't happen in every case.
Could you briefly describe the initiative in Ukraine and your ongoing project in Ukraine?
Yes, after opening the museum, I mean, when we created the War Childhood Museum in Bosnia, we never wanted it to be limited by the borders of our country. We wanted this platform to be shared, to bring together all of these affected people and communities. And we, very soon after opening museum, we started to expand our collection internationally, and one of the first documentation projects we did was in the east of Ukraine. We started in 2018. No one in Europe at the time was talking about this war, but it was already a big war in the east of the country, and of course with occupation of Crimea. So we started creating a small collection there. But Ukraine is a huge country, and then there were already millions of internally displaced people around the country. So we started working in different regions to document their experience of these children and youth. And then we understood it's so big that we have to open office there. So in 2020, we opened office in Kiev to sustain this work. Of course, we didn't know what's coming, but after the full-scale invasion started, all children in Ukraine are affected by war now, not only internally displaced children from Crimea and from the east. So now our collection is expanding. It's a very diverse collection that tells about experience of children who stayed in the country and those who left the country as refugees, also children living along the front lines, and also children living around the country in different regions, what brings us to the discussion about different intensities of the conflict and completely different experience in different parts of the country, but also some, let's say, communities whose voice is underrepresented in the public space, like national minorities whose culture is threatened, or children of fallen soldiers, etc. So it's a diverse collection with over 600 testimonies now, and probably one of the major documents about this big war from the perspective of children.
Yael Danieli, we just learned, and this is a topic I know which is very important for you, that it's not about raising awareness to create room for dialogue, but it's also about the healing dimension of talking about the suffering of traumata, of war situation, of terror. And I would like to quote one of your findings, one of your very early findings, but I found an article from 2007 where you repeated it, that in the 60s you started to interview the survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. And you realized that the survivors and their later children had the impression, understood, that people who had not gone through the same experience could not understand or did not want to understand, did not care, both with regards to health or other mental health support or other professions, legal professions. There was what you called the conspiracy of silence. You created, or you somehow worked on this topic of conspiracy of silence many years ago, but this publication is from 2007, and it shows that the conspiracy of silence at the time then seemed to be a relevant topic. Would you say that this is changing to some extent, or is there still what you would describe a conspiracy of silence in the way that the dialogue is not wanted, that it's by the public which has not experienced the same suffering?
Yeah, I actually did my second doctorate on the conspiracy of silence after I learned from survivors 100% of the time this is not a finding you have in science. phrases like nobody listened, nobody wanted to listen, nobody believed, even therapists, even lawyers, even judges. Instead of continue to focus on what I did the first time on the psychology of hope, I changed to study the conspiracy of silence, and in particular, I chose to study psychoanalysts because they are trained, it's the only profession that is trained both to listen to the other and to listen to themselves listening to the other. Because I wanted a profession that will explain to me how come humanity seems not to care for its most vulnerable people. So I found 49 ways of not listening. 49 ways of not listening. We are very creative human beings. We are complex organisms. I found that also among lawyers and judges. I found that among all professions that interface with victims. Okay, at every age. I also did it for children, those people who work with children. It's worth studying, and actually that led me eventually to build the field of reparative justice, where in fact, at every moment of the justice process, even before we begin, it's like before you even begin a case, what's your image of the victim? What goes through your mind about where you're going, what you're going to find? What does your body tell you about how you feel about landing there? So the notion of interacting with massive trauma doesn't begin when you're there. It begins way before. Each one of us has pictures of all these places, whether we were there or not. And I'm not focusing on children right now, but because it's true, period. So reparative justice acknowledges that it is an integral part of justice that the justice process is equally or more important than the justice outcome. And that we are in relationship with the victims. You know, when we are in the relationship, we usually call each other up, how are you, etc. In the ICC, we call it, we call it outreach. But it's nicer if you stay in contact with the victims. You acknowledge your relationship onward, and what kind of relationship, etc. We are not going to devote the whole discussion on that. But and that relationship extends to after the judgment, of course, after the reparation decisions, right? When the victim looks back at the justice system and at the justice process and at its own, what does it mean to have received justice? But let me continue. At the entrance to my office, for many years, I had a quote of Bruno Bettelheim. You know, he was a Holocaust survivor, a psychiatrist. And this was a footnote in a book about children, in a book about those children that's called I Didn't Say Goodbye. Right? A lot of children remain very, very sad that they couldn't say goodbye. And that was no goodbye said to them. But in a footnote in that tiny little book, Bruno Bettelheim wrote, when you cannot put things into words, you can also not put them to rest. And if you do not, the wounds continue to fester from generation to generation. I can share it in writing later because it's part of what, when you do speak. So this is an element of healing, to speak. Actually, an element combined healing and continuity in justice is, you know, every victim knows only his or her story. I used to say everyone in a bank in Auschwitz knew only its own banks, not the one on top, not the one on only yours. The justice system coheres the story. And not only, you don't only cohere the story, which is very healing, you establish continuity, right? But you also heal the identity. You acknowledge. You're saying, yes, it did happen to you, and you deserve justice. It's not your fault, right? And we are sorry it happened to you. How healing is that? So there are many healing aspects to justice. But the one thing that I'm still fighting with is the time dimension, because justice is timeless. The indigenous people today, the victims of slavery today, are claiming reparations for 400 years ago. Of course, also for the systemic, etc., etc. The need for justice doesn't go away. But let me go back to the conspiracy of silence. That is why when we built the first program to help Nazi Holocaust survivors and their children, we didn't only believe in individual therapy, didn't make much sense, really, also because we weren't trained to treat them. We brought groups and community meetings. And you see, part of what trauma does, in particularly to children, is Elie Wiesel used to say, we have no words. In a group setting, each one might find one of the words, you see, and it helps together to put the narrative. Justice does that too, by the way, but when it's done reparatively. So the notion of we have no words, to put things into words, to cohere the story as an element of healing is unbelievably important. Now, we are sitting here in the West. It is true that some cultures don't do words. And in fact, words might be dangerous. In the Philippines, during the regime, you weren't allowed to talk. So what did they do? They found dancing. They would collect in the corner of the street and express via dancing. They weren't talking. They were not breaking the law, but they were telling the story. So words are a Western insistence, but what I'm saying is we can do the narrative, continuous narrative, even without actual words, although words really do happen to humans, because there is 3 issues, just quickly, both for the victims and for the professionals. One is to be able to identify what's wrong, right? Recognize what's wrong. Another is to be able to contain the feelings, because of course the emotions are very intense or intensely numb, right? And the third aspect is to try to heal and even grow. So it's dangerous to ask me about that.
No. I would like to continue this very important aspect, because when looking at the convention, this is a summary of it. The right which fascinated me the most was Article 39, the recovery from trauma, and the right to reintegration. And this is just what you are talking about. This is a human right to be recovered from trauma. And I was wondering about the practicability of this right, because to be heard necessitates someone to listen and to be able to listen. It asks for structures, for a system of support and recovery. What if the overall population, society is traumatized? What if the adults are unable to listen? What if the state system financially doesn't have the means to create psychological support infrastructures, interventions at school? What if the surrounding of the child is also suffering and failing? So I think this is a most important right, as you describe it. At the same time, how can it be realized?
Well, first of all, that right, and as you say, it's a very important right, Article 39, that states must take all appropriate measures to promote physical and psychological recovery and social reintegration of child victims of many things, but including armed conflict. And of course, this right exists even in the midst of an armed conflict, although it may be very difficult for a state to be able to carry it out. But also, we should ask ourselves there, in an active conflict, which states parties have that responsibility? Yeah. And what can be avoided, and what can be done in the interim period whilst the armed conflict's going on? But this right would also continue long after the armed conflict has completed, and I think this was the point that Jasminko was also making, that it will take a long time, but it should still be on the agenda. But it also strikes me that it can't only be the responsibility of the state party that will be left to clean up the mess after the armed conflict is over. And that's where the international, where international law and international responsibility and cooperation comes into it as well. One thing that I think has been interesting lately, in the last couple of years, is how we've seen states actually starting to understand that you can bring a case to the ICJ as a state, even if you're not directly involved in that armed conflict. You can just say, as a state, we have a responsibility to stop that from happening. And so I like the fact that states are starting to take their responsibilities as far as children in armed conflict is concerned, more broadly than just thinking about their responsibilities to the children in their own country, but actually starting to think beyond the borders of that, which is encouraging, and we'll see where it goes.
Jasminko, do you want to have the maybe final words on the right to recovery and the question of how can this important right to be realized?
Yes, it's a little time and many things to comment on. I think this awareness which now exists more and more in the world about the need to listen to the children is very important. I think the second step after this awareness to listen to the children is to try to understand the children and their experiences in a respectful way. I think what we still have overwhelmingly present is this portrait of children affected by war as passive victims of conflicts. And this is not in line what we see in our collection. They are not passive, and children want to be seen with dignity and to preserve their dignity. This is part of the justice we are discussing as well. So not only to listen to these stories and to those affected, but also how we listen, if we listen with respect and if we show respect towards their experience, and this touches upon resilience, which you mentioned. We have in our collection, for example, stories of older children organizing school for younger children in the basements in very tough conditions, so taking the responsibility, supporting adults, etc. So we need to see the full picture, and only if we see the full picture, we can hope to create environment as adults where these children will, if they survive, obviously that's the condition, will hopefully recover and prosper in their life and reach their full potential. So we need to understand that this is very complex experiences they are facing. And another thing is also what we shouldn't do as society is to further open wounds, and we have this very much present in the public space by denying their experiences. So denial is another circle which is putting us a few steps back all the time, and we see this even with Holocaust still, but we see it also with events that are more recent. So I think our task as society is to talk more about respect when it comes to listening to stories of those affected. And I think on forums like this one, we should also maybe have children and youth to hear from them directly.
Yeah, just to add to the rights of victims, this is one of my babies, I love it. It's the United Nations Declaration on Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Victims of Abuse of Power. And to add, let's not forget that victims have the right to truth. Extremely important part of the narrative, to know what actually happened, how did it happen, to whom. Otherwise, they must remain vindicated. They must feel guilty and keep vindicating, trying to vindicate, which is like a black hole. It's undoable, right? So I wanted, but I will be totally remiss if I didn't speak about the distinction between child victims and children of victims. Judge Schmidt knows how happy his last reparation judgment made me feel. I mean, I literally celebrated it because he acknowledged that children of rape, that is, were born after rape, have rights. And in that acknowledged intergenerational transmission of trauma. Also made me happy because he acknowledged that family is not necessarily only family Western style, right? That family depends totally on the cultural context. And we didn't talk enough about cultures, but I know we will talk about culture in the next 2 days too. But so that's very important. Let me just share with you very quickly some of the concepts of multi-generational legacies of trauma. We didn't do that today, which makes sense because children are now. But I want to take you on imagining these children as parents, right? The healing, the prevention, Pablo is Mr. Prevention here. The healing and the prevention of the multi-generational effects on the next generation is humanity's responsibility, even if we haven't made that a convention yet. But we will, if not in our generation, in the next one. And in my, I've written a great deal about that. So in 2 minutes, as I said before, victims respond heterogeneously. According to our research, and in effect, there is an assessment tool to assess multi-generational legacies of trauma. It exists. I created it because there was no one, and I want the law to know that it exists. You can measure it scientifically. So when you measure it, you tend to find at least 3 different, what I call post-trauma adaptational styles. I call it adaptational styles simply because victims adapt to what they have. I'm not much of a medical diagnostic person. I know this stuff. But I really care more about how it is to live, okay, with what you went through. So there are three styles, very simple, not so simple. The victim style, people who, their whole being for the rest of their lives, their sensibilities, their identity is victim. I've written a great deal. Those of you who are interested, please do read, because I describe lives, not just words. And the next style is the fighter style, okay? People are always ready to fight. And try in your body to feel what it's like to be a fighter. You're not sleeping, you're not relaxing, because if you do, you might die. So, and some people live like that. Elie Wiesel never slept on his own after the Holocaust. And he's just, I'm telling it because he told it to other people. But I cannot tell you about others, but that's quite common. It's like you have to be ready. But also people, and the third one is what we call the numb style. People who still live as if it happened yesterday, right? They are ice, like in ice. Try to imagine children born into that style, right? Because that style becomes the biopsychosocial milieu of the next generation, of the baby. Try to imagine being born to somebody who cries every night. Okay, use your imagination, read what I want to tell you, and this has, because Prosecutor Khan is here, I want out of respect to say that it is the victims, the children born to the victim style, who might be most affected. Now think about it. The length of time of a trial keeps a person, a victim, as long as they need to keep proving that they were victims. And the onus is on the victim. Think about it. Think about what it means for the future. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to moralize, but when you have to collapse things, you sound like a television commercial.
No, not at all. I think we could not have had a better conclusion to this discussion, which is a call to translate what you've described as a holistic perspective of suffering of children in armed conflict into legal solution, into legal approaches. And I thank you all very much for this inspiring discussion, which I liked very much. And I hope that we all have an inspiring conference for the next 2 days. Thank you very much.